My point in mentioning Shattuck's Paris years, where the idea of writing the book, writing the book is crystallized, is to demonstrate how this post-war Paris sojourn perpetuated his nonconformist lifestyle. Graduated from Yale in '47, he journeyed alone to France with $600 he had saved in the service. Nora joined him later after first going with the Ballet Russe to Mexico. Properly fortified for his adventure with a letter of introduction to Alice B. Toklas, alas, Gertrude Stein had died the year before. The former editor of the Yale Review, using his Army PX privileges, was able to furnish Toklas, who had already commenced writing her celebrated cookbook with hard-to-obtain post-war delicacies like butter and heavy cream. We worked out a wonderful exchange, commented Roger. In return, Toklas asked me to many luncheons. You sat for her meals on her embroidered upholstery of patterns made by Picasso. She introduced me to lots of people, among them Thornton Wilder, Cocteau, Braque, and Fernande Olivier, Picasso's first mistress in her 60s, who coquettishly offered to give Roger French lessons, which I suspect he did not need. To paraphrase Shattuck writing about the tragic life of the insurrectionist French playwright Alfred Jarry, Paris did not intimidate Shattuck, at least not on the surface. Perhaps not as inebriated, chemically altered, or as violently zealous in his desire to overthrow the established order as Jarry, whose pistol Pablo Picasso later acquired and flaunted on his nocturnal jaunts. Shattuck felt entirely at home in the liberated bohemian atmosphere that suffused Paris. An ocean removed from his family, he didn't have to worry about the gentle reproofs of Mother Shattuck, nor would he be reminded of the conflagrations of war that he had witnessed firsthand, a subject I will return to. Paris had once again become a place where all sorts of fantasies secreted in the unconscious mind, where fantasies of every sort beckoned to those wishing to jettison the horrific nightmares that had devastated the continent suddenly could be expressed. All sorts of intellectuals, artistes, and aesthetes therefore arrived, eager to sample this nectar of hedonism, whether on the left bank in the Latin Quarter or on the slopes of the Montmartre. Some invariably lost their footing and drowned in the excesses. Roger did not. To call him merely a voyeur of this cultural bacchanal would be inaccurate, but he was no mattered expatriate either in the tradition of Henry James. There was something almost atavistic. Roger, after all, as Jed Perl points out, did call himself half tame in a poem he later wrote for his wife that drew him to the, quote, wild animal cage, where Fauvism had come into being a century before, where Matisse and Braque exhibited their works alongside a huge predatory jungle scene drawn by Rousseau. Shattuck comments in the banquet years about the handsome and popular Prince of Wales who neglected the attractions of London to spend his evenings entertaining in Maxime's before taking on his solemn duties as Edward VII. Though experiencing Paris in a later era and from a far less regal perspective, we must ascribe to our Roger a similar curiosity, if not indulgence. Like Edward VII, he would return to the fold, but thoroughly transformed. In fact, so indelible were the influences of this sojourn that he would commence 8 years later the first major work. I reread parts of the banquet years earlier this year, and it is hardly a work that has aged. I might add that while Ernest Hemingway, a canonical novelist and Nobel laureate, is far more recognized than Professor Shattuck, his immovable feast, that classic portrait of America's expatriates in Paris in the 20s, does not measure up to the incendiary observations and high lyricism on display in almost every page of the banquet years, where Shattuck, I found, can float golden notes that turn the eruption of dream into waking experience, a phrase he once used to describe Jarry. He recreates the cultural fermentation of La Belle Époque and the fin de siècle with such astonishing vigor that you feel as if you've been transported to the waning years of the 19th and the incipient years of the 20th, when the nationalistic war cries of the European powers finally drowned out the excesses of the artistic classes. A ribald passage from the first chapter explains Shattuck's choice of title. The banquet had become the supreme rite, the cultural capital of the world, which sets fashion and dress, the arts, and the pleasures of life, celebrated its vitality over a long table laden with food and wine. The only barrier to rampant adultery was the whalebone corset. Many an errant wife, when she returned to face her waiting coachman, had to hide under her coat the bundle of undergarments which her lover had not been dexterous enough to lace back around her torso. Bourgeois meals reached such proportions that at intermission had to be introduced in the form of sherbet course between two foul dishes. And that you find that animation on almost every page. I cite the work not only to recognize it, but to underscore what I see as his duality of character. His fascination with the demi-monde, with those artists seething with rage, whose break with classical form revolutionized 20th century art. And on the other hand, his intellectual wariness, which became pronounced in the years I knew him, although these two impulses may be far more entwined than you might think. Curiously, the word forbidden, I've come to realize, holds significant meaning in both forms. And it is an adjective that recurs in Shattuck's body of work, as in The Forbidden Experiment, the story of the wild boy of Avignon, as well as in his 1996 Jeremiah, Forbidden Knowledge. Particularly instructive in this later work I found is a revealing chapter, Pleasures of Abstinence. It was also excerpted in the New York Review of Books, which Roger seems to commune with none other than Amherst's veiled poet, Emily Dickinson. Note Shattuck, while describing her personality, we can acknowledge that some precise states of body and mind are characterized by fragility. They may be shattered by too close, too rough, or too prolonged an encounter with the desired object or person. Let me repeat this phrase, may be shattered by too close, too rough, or too prolonged an encounter. Because Roger may have, even unknowingly, recognized in himself a fragility he was ascribing to the recluse in the white dress. As I was conversing with those who knew him, as I was rereading the books and body of criticism in the New York Review of Books, I kept returning to the image of the man who staunchly, though of course quite politely, resisted email, who he treated not as Dickinson did to her father's cat-infested manse in Amherst, but to a hut perched at the edge of a primeval forest in the shadow of Vermont's Green Mountains. Why did this man, who had been raised in very stately Manhattan, who had taught in the hub of Boston, feel that technology had brought an army of Frankenstein-like incubi he no longer wished to countenance? The key to understanding his dread of ghostly apparitions can be found neither in the boîtes of liberated Paris nor on the frontiers of Bill Gates' cyberspace. Though he seems only to have written about his personal war experiences in his private journals, I had become convinced well before Nora sent me snippets from these journals that the war had psychologically traumatized him, affecting him existentially as any other experience had. Even before the Americans detonated the atomic bomb, Shattuck described a world gone horribly awry, where anodynes of any sort were utterly useless. The Navy ships had their own strange customs and practices, he writes in the Okinawa and Korea Journal of August-September 1945. Did 2 shots of whiskey really help jangle nerves or accumulated tension after a long combat mission? No one asked. It was established practice. You weren't a man unless you tossed down your liquor without a wince, even in mid-morning. And then the imponderable. Flying in September on a mission with his friend Stan Friedman, a tall Ichabod Crane of a soldier, Roger's description, by the way, who had trained with Shattuck in Texas. The two stared from high above at the radioactive rubble where Hiroshima had breathed just a month before. Like Washington Irving's Ichabod Crane, the men were suddenly confronted with a ghostly, surrealistic image, far more jarring than the decapitated head of the Hessian soldier, which Ichabod observes on his way home from the Van Tassel's party. But if you read the journal here, there's something very peculiar. Despite flying over the urban carnage at an altitude of 1,000 feet or less, and making at least one full circle of the area, neither airman trying to recall the experience 40 years later possessed even the slightest recollection of having seen anything. I lack the psychological training to examine repressed or banished memory, nor have I consulted with the experts in the field. I cannot therefore account for this memory lapse of either Shattuck or Friedman, except to repeat Roger's words. This Ehrlich's inspection did not fill us with horror or convert us on the spot to pacifism. The mushroom cloud had boomed and disappeared long since. It had not yet, and I emphasize these last two words, been brought back for us in graphic images still or moving. We came, we saw, we went back, not much the wiser. Strangely, it was a monstrous typhoon 1 month later which had been dragging darkly across the stretch of the Pacific south of Japan, which Shattuck focuses on in his journal, describing funnel-like gusts that raged at 150 miles per hour and engulfed the camp of the 308th Bomb Wing with terrifying black clouds that clipped the ground. Equally terrifying was the infernal voyage home in November and December aboard the USS Seabar, a rusting hulk of a troop ship crammed with thousands of soldiers. Again, no mention of Hiroshima in the journals, but this section bears little similarity to the melodramatic, tragicomic tales that would garner Michener a Pulitzer Prize for his novel, Tales of the South Pacific. Instead, we're presented with a grotesque description of a fetid shiphold where, quote, many men just lay there, some stunned, some jabbering away to neighbors who never listened. A passage that emphasizes psychological trauma these homebound soldiers were experiencing. But here Shattuck does not lack for memory. Nothing is repressed. He recalls a plague which rendered the entire ship pitifully sick and literally paralyzed. He creates an atmosphere filled with hate and prejudice, his words, where the bunks drew out the most debased opinions about politics, sex, commanding generals in every classification of humanity. In short, a monstrous tableau filled with all the scatological horrors of an Albert Jarry absurdist drama with none of the dark humor to leaven it. Even as the Seabar belatedly streamed into the welcoming harbor of San Francisco in December, an emotionally spent Shattuck could only exclaim, "I am purged now. My catharsis is over, yet I am not clean." Though Shattuck was never able to retrieve his memories of the horrors mankind unleashed in Hiroshima, his subsequent writings wrestle with the consequences of this defining event. Though I, in fact, published, as the third of Roger's 3 Proust works, I'm not a Proust scholar, so I will leave such an exegesis to others here today. Instead, I've chosen to concentrate on the Shattuck legacy that I know best, and I've tried to grapple with some of the issues that most vexed Roger. His attempt to cleanse himself, to steer others out of evil's way, to protect them from witnessing as he saw the collapse of humanistic learning, became then a lifelong mission, as would his fight to combat injustice, to fight for a black singer to not allowed to sing at the opera in the University of Texas, which John Silber told me about just the other day. He also very early on fought the Vietnam War. It would be an easy but cheap shot to lampoon Roger then for his fruitless battle to keep Apple computers out of Vermont schools. Yet his Sisyphean struggle to batten down the hatches of a small New England community, I think, does take on larger meaning. Harold Bloom concurs that, quote, Roger was right that technology corrupted modern life, noting his own lack of technical proficiency comes out of, he says, ineptness, while Rogers came out of the vision of the way he wanted life to be. The inevitable horrors of Hiroshima had produced in his mind a reality so monstrous that he feared we had, quote, transgressed all boundaries. Informed by the myth of Prometheus, whose theft of fire had angered by the gods, Roger became convinced that there could be no return when certain codes of moral behavior were broken. Not surprisingly, a soulmate in forbidden knowledge would become J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had not opposed the policy decisions, Roger writes, that led to the immense destruction of civilians at Hiroshima and at Nagasaki, but later confessed his guilt and acknowledged the consequences of his deed. Like Auden, Roger too dreamed of terrifying monsters, for in the end he was living on a farm where, quote, no one wakes.